Everyone knows that this weekend is the UN post-2015 Development Summit. It's basically the heads of states and the Pope are gathering this weekend to talk about their Millennium Development Goals, which were announced back in 2000. If people are familiar with the MDGs, they're basically a list of goals that actually sound really, really good. Eradicating poverty, lowering child mortality rates, providing accessible health care. And these sound very, very good. But we also know that over the last 15 years, these things haven't been achieved. Not only have these things not been achieved, life has gotten worse and more miserable for the majority of the world's people. So in our view, the MDGs were always a Trojan horse for greater neoliberal economic policies. And so this weekend, the heads of state are going to come together again and basically say, we achieved what we had set forth to do. We achieved all these goals. They were so effective that we're going to continue with these goals. But we're not going to call them the Millennium Development Goals. We're going to call them the Sustainable Development Goals. And the continuation of that Trojan horse tactic to sugarcoat what is essentially greater neoliberalism around the world. And what do I mean when I say neoliberalism? I think that's very, very central to the topic of migration in the era of imperialism. Migration in the era of imperialism, or in this case, neoliberal globalization, is not a choice. We call it forced migration. Why do we call it forced migration? Because mothers and fathers don't normally choose to leave their children behind and to raise other people's kids. They don't choose to do that. They do it to save their own children, from poverty. So they make those sacrifices, and in countries all over the world, especially like the Philippines, families are being torn apart every day. We are raising generations of parentless children whose own parents, because of their disposition as overseas workers, whose only value are to be cash cows for the Philippine economy through their remittances, are therefore commodified by their own families. So it really interrupts the family relations as well. And you see it here in New York City. You see women raising children who aren't their own, who actually are closer to other people's children than their own. It's a very, very sad. I think the Philippines is, I want to just, because I'm most knowledgeable about the Philippine situation, the Philippine labor export policy is touted by the UN as the ideal model of migration as a tool for development. In 2013, the Global Forum on Migration and Development, which is a UN-sanctioned body under the UN high-level dialogue on development, met in New York City to discuss that how can they improve migration as a tool for development. When you think about that, in the Philippines, the labor export policy of the Philippines is always seen as a model, because the labor export policy is a government-run policy that was basically created in the 1970s under the Marcos dictatorship as a relief program to stave off joblessness and poverty in the country by exporting workers and having them remit back to the economy. But what was supposed to be a temporary relief program ended up being a permanent program. So till this day, Philippine migration is essential to sustaining the Philippine economy. We are one of the most remittance-dependent economies in the world. Every year, Filipino overseas workers remit up to 20 billion back to the country. And without that, the Philippine economy will crumble. So the Philippines has always been, even from when we were a direct colony of the U.S. from 1898 to 1946, and then a neo-colony of the U.S. from 1946 to the present. The U.S. has always been actively engaging in economic policy making for the country. So this is also a question of economic sovereignty. So going back to the question of neoliberalism, neoliberalism has essentially for the Filipino people been about three main things and also a fourth thing. Liberalization of trade and investments, privatization, and deregulation of laws and standards, which essentially means you've basically denationalized your country. You've denationalized your economy, you've denationalized your political system, and this is why we are a neo-colony. If we are not in control of these aspects of our society, we are a neo-colony. And now, from the 2000s to now, the U.S. engages in economic policy making in the country through its agencies like USAID, which is all over the Philippines right now. And in the context of the so-called U.S. pivot to Asia, one thing to also realize is that what is so misleading about the term pivot is that it completely ignores the fact that the U.S. has been in the region for forever. So for 100 years. So the largest global command of the U.S. military is based in the Pacific. So the U.S. Pacific Command. Why is the U.S. Pacific Command the oldest and largest of all the global commands of the U.S. Armed Forces? Because it's in that area of the world where you have the most major shipping lanes that are crucial to investment and trade. And the purpose of a U.S. military base historically, geopolitically, is to ensure economic hegemony. So it's, as much as they want to claim that it's for defense and for security, of what? Defense and security of the shipping lanes, not of the nations. Right now in the Philippines, and this story is very, very common in other parts of the world, particularly in Latin America. We have a lot in common with Latin America in the neo-colonial sense. The Philippine economy is import dependent and export oriented, which means that it's in chronic debt and always beholden to foreign investment. Our economy is not based on industrial production because, first of all, part of the thrust of U.S. economic policy making in the Philippines is to repress local agriculture and also stunt industrialization. So in our country, we don't make anything. We just give away everything. We give away our people, we give away our gold, we give away our oil, we give away our trees, we give everything for cheap. And we have to rely on importing expensive finished products for daily living, which leaves the country impoverished. And those are the conditions that lead to migration. That's why we call it forced, because if the country was actually sovereign and could actually develop its own industries and develop its agricultural production, would be a self-reliant economy and a self-reliant country, and we could employ our own people. But that's not the case. On tomorrow, we are going to be in response to what's happening in the UN, and also to connect the struggles of migrant workers and all other displaced peoples, particularly refugees from the Middle East and North Africa who are being displaced from their homelands and are searching for a safe haven and are being met with repression and racism across Europe. We want to connect those struggles because it's the same root. It's the same root cause. It's its monopoly capitalism, undermining, overthrowing our economic and political systems in order to seize markets, seize control of our economy, seize resources, and seize territories. So if we don't connect these things, it'll be harder to understand and build a movement to defeat this global economic system. So tomorrow is the 1-year anniversary of the disappearance of the 43 Ayotzinapa students who were disappeared because they were going to a protest to protest neoliberal economic reforms in the Mexican education system. So, and they were targeted. So in countries like the Philippines and all over the world, those who protest neoliberal economic policies or neoliberal reforms are targeted with state repression. So that's the case in the Philippines, the case all over Latin America, where there are these dirty wars. These are these U.S.-funded dirty wars that are not being waged necessarily by U.S. troops, but are being funded and armed by U.S. Arms and U.S. tax dollars. And also, troops are there to advise their proxy armies, their mercenary armies. Certainly, that's the case in West Asia, in the Middle East, in West Asia. So, I think I'm gonna leave it there. So tomorrow, if it's gonna start at 5 o'clock, I just came from the International Tribunal of Conscience on U.S. foreign policy's impact on Mexico and Central America, which is happening this weekend also at New York University, and I'm going to return there in a bit. But so this rally starts at 5 o'clock tomorrow. We're meeting at the south end of Washington Square Park on Thompson Street and Washington Square South, and we'll have a program. We will have speakers from the tribunal and speakers representing the different displaced peoples of the world. And we'll proceed with a march up 6th Avenue to 31st Street, where there will be another program related to the tribunal at St. Francis Church on 31st Street. So thank you very much.
I'm sure we've all seen the headlines in Europe. There's been so many racist attacks against people from the Middle East who are heading into Europe. And, we see the headlines every day. People are being bombarded with rocks. They're being shot at. They're being literally beaten by police officers in countries like Hungary, Romania, etc. The focus of today's forum, is United States, European Union imperialism causing a migrant refugee crisis. And the focus, what I want to focus on today is not necessarily explaining the specifics of it, but what I want to talk about is how us as revolutionaries and as Marxist-Leninists can explain this to the everyday person that we confront, whether it's our neighbors or fellow students or colleagues, etc. Because I think it's important to it's a very complex yet simple situation at the same time. But I think it's important for us as revolutionaries to be able to explain it in a way that represents what this is really about. And what this is really about is imperialism. This is really about United States imperialism and European Union imperialism. So I also want to emphasize that this isn't just a crisis, but this is a crises in the plural form, because there are many migrant refugee crises that are happening around the world right now. Last year, if you remember, there were images of children coming from Mexico and Central America who were, these were children who were unaccompanied, who were all alone in facilities in Texas, around the border of Texas and Mexico. And last summer, that was the big media coverage. It was like the child migrant crisis, and that was in the headlines. This year, what has made headlines is the migrant refugee crisis of people from Middle East coming and Africa coming into Europe. What I want to emphasize today is that both are happening simultaneously. One didn't end and the other didn't begin, like start and stop. They're both happening at the same time. They're happening simultaneously. There is still a migrant refugee crisis from people in Latin America. There's still a migrant refugee crisis from the Middle East. And their root origin is US and European Union imperialism. And it's very important that we explain to people why the US and the European Union are completely responsible for everything that's going on. The way they've been covered is horrendous because basically all of these bourgeois media organizations have been covering it in a way that makes it seem as if, out of nowhere, just like millions of people just out of nowhere decided to just go to Europe and fuck it, I'm just gonna go to Europe today. And it's crazy. Like that's the way the media has been making it seem, like just people out of nowhere just woke up one morning and were like, I'm just gonna go to Germany. That's not what's going on. Like this is what I'm trying to say is, this is a perfect situation. This is a perfect scenario to not only show our solidarity with these migrants, right, with these refugees, but for us as communists to be able to explain theoretically why this is happening. Not just, I think it's important, yes, like I'm going to be there tomorrow. Like it's so important for us to show our solidarity and in practice to show our solidarity, but we also need to explain it. We need to explain it to everyone why this is happening. And I think we have to go back to basics of Marxist Leninist like ideology of like dialectical materialism of material conditions. We have to go over the basics again and explain this to people, because if we're not explaining it, people are not going to understand it. Because right now, the majority of people see completely different things. They see on one side, they see like ISIS and like US like bombings, etc. I'm not saying that it's not being covered, but it's being treated as completely isolated and separated from the migrant crisis. If you look at the coverage of CNN and Fox and all of the rest of the bourgeois media, they're in their coverage of the migrant refugee crisis of the Middle East into Europe, not once is mentioned, the false flag attacks against President Bashar al-Assad in Syria, the imperialist invasion of Libya, and the imperialist U.S. Saudi bombings in Yemen. Like they're being treated as completely isolated phenomena in the bourgeois media. And this is the perfect way, this is the perfect opportunity for us as revolutionaries to explain to people how interconnected these phenomena are and why the US and the European Union are completely to blame for everything that's going on. So I first, this is, I want to address everyone that's here, of course, but I know this is going on YouTube. So for, the viewers who are watching this at home, I think it's really important to kind of go over this. US, European Union imperialism. What is imperialism? Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism, right? As Vladimir Lenin writes about in his book, Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism. It's available. Go to Marxist.org. It's available right there. This is basically talking about a stage of capitalism, which is the globally dominant economic system that we live in now, where people confront each other on the basis of money, of commodities, right? Where this is an era, this is a stage of history where countries like the United States, like Germany, France, Italy, are no longer able to make money within their own countries, finance capital, as Comrade Bernadette mentioned earlier. These countries are no longer able to make money in the U.S. We can look at companies like McDonald's, right? We can look at Burger King. When's the last time anyone here has eaten at McDonald's? Right? It's, these are corporations that are no longer able to make a profit at home. So now they're forced by the laws of capitalism to expand their borders. They need to go into these new countries, right? So what I'm here to say is, we have to go over imperialism. Imperialism is the highest stage of capitalism. It's basically these corporations that are taking command of the state, profits in command, like Mao Zedong says, right? Profits in command. These corporations that take control of the state as a tool, as an instrument, and basically use the state as a way to invade new countries, to create a market situation where they can now sell their product and make a profit. If you go to a lot of countries in Latin America, in the Middle East, these are the countries that companies like McDonald's, Burger King, Pepsi, Coca-Cola are focusing their attention on, because they're no longer lucrative in the US and the European Union. So this is completely connected with the migrant crisis, because if we look at the countries that are being affected by this migrant refugee crisis, these are all the countries that at some point were resisting or were in the efforts to resist capitalism and imperialism. So, starting off with the Middle East, we have, who are the people that are coming into Europe and into Germany and Romania, et cetera, and Hungary? These are people from Syria, Libya, Yemen, and Iraq, right? We can go one by one in each of these countries and explain why US and the European Union are completely responsible for the reasons why these people are leaving their countries to begin with. Libya had the highest life expectancy rate in all of Africa. Libya used to hold conferences, annually on like African empowerment, African liberation. They were forming their own independent economic system apart from US and European imperialism. Syria has been resisting imperialism for many years. Yemen, is a country that's rich with many resources and with a mass movement that's trying to move away from the Wall Street, funded Gulf states, right, that are trying to basically expropriate their natural resources and have all those resources redirected back to, the US and Europe. And Iraq, let's not even, there's so much to say about Iraq, right? 2003 and moving forward, basically US bombing of Baghdad, and for many years, US imperialism in that country. All of the countries in the Middle East that have been affected by U.S. imperialism, that have been completely brutalized by U.S. imperialism, the people of those countries are now moving to Europe. That's their only, for many people, this is life and death. This is their only way out to survive. And we have to remember as revolutionaries that, it's important to mention the historical context of these countries and why people are leaving those countries. And the same applies for Latin America. If we look at Latin America, the countries that people are coming from in Latin America, the people aren't coming in waves from Venezuela. They're not coming in waves from Cuba. They're not coming in waves from Bolivia. They're coming from all the capitalist US-aligned countries that are basically neo-colonies of the US. Mexico, Honduras, República Dominicana, Guatemala, right? Puerto Rico. These are all the countries that are under the boot of US imperialism. Just like in the Middle East, all the countries that are being victimized right now, that are being attacked by U.S. imperialism, by U.S. Forces, by U.S. trained, backed, and funded forces, these are the countries from which people are arriving to Europe. So I think it's so important for us as Marxist-Leninists to really emphasize this isn't just a crisis in an isolated form. These are crises, right, that are interdependent, interconnected, and completely, are a response to imperialism. People didn't decide out of nowhere, I'm just going to move to Germany, I'm going to move to the US. This is a reaction. This is not an action, this is a reaction. And this goes back to our scientific and theoretical understanding of reality, right? This is what Marx and Lenin talks about with their understanding of dialectical materialism, of material conditions determining consciousness. Matter being determines consciousness. People's material conditions determine the way they think and their responses. If you live in a country that's being completely bombarded and bombed and attacked by, U.S. and Saudi fighter jets, or if you're in Honduras and you're in a country with U.S. funded death squads, or in Mexico with U.S. funded death squads, obviously you're gonna, as a human being, as you're gonna seek you're gonna seek your continued survival. You're gonna seek somewhere where you can survive, and oftentimes the only place where you can survive is the empire itself. We can go back in history to the Roman Empire. Look at migration patterns during the Roman Empire. We had mass migrations of people from the Middle East and Northern Africa who are moving to Rome, right? And the Romans were taking advantage of that. The Romans used to invade the Middle East and Africa and all parts of the world, and those people from those colonies would move to Rome and work. What were the three classes in Rome? There was the plebeians, the patricians, and the auxiliaries, right? The slaves, right? The slaves, exactly. So you would have these people from the colonies fulfilling those roles in Rome. Same thing is going on today. It's just in a new, higher qualitative level, right? The U.S., New York. Look at New York is Rome. Wall Street. This is the capital of capitalism, right? All the people from Latin America who are being pillaged in their own countries are moving here. I just got a call earlier this week from a relative from my home country of Honduras, who just crossed the border, and was like, I got threatened by death squads over there. I'm coming here. This is the only place where I can go. This is the only place left with resources, and not even, because the empire is already crumbling. So I think it's so important to really emphasize in talking about the migrant crisis, not only the specifics, right? It is important to mention what's happening, who's being affected. That's important, but I think it's also important to use this as an opportunity to explain to people why, as revolutionaries, we have to study phenomena that is going on in society in a different way than the bourgeois thinkers, right? Because the way the bourgeois media has been covering it is that the migrant crisis, the migrants are the principal actors. The immigrants who are coming from Syria, from Libya, from Yemen, Iraq, this is the cause. And now Germany, France, Italy has to react to that. That's the way it's being treated, right? The cause are the migrants, and the effect is, okay, Germany, okay, we'll take 80,000 migrants. Italy will take whatever. What I'm here to say is that's wrong, incorrect way of thinking. The cause is imperialist attacks in those countries. That is the cause, right? And the effect are the migrants coming into those countries. The migrants aren't the cause of these problems. They're the effect. They're responding to their material conditions. Is like we mentioned before, being determines consciousness. These are people who are responding to their immediate material conditions. We're talking about hospitals being bombed, schools being bombed, their immediate material conditions being obliterated. They're responding to a situation. They're not causing it. So I really want to emphasize that we have to revisit how we explain these phenomena. And we have to emphasize the fact that the problem isn't immigration. The problem is imperialism. The problem is the reasons why these people are coming here to begin with. If the U.S. didn't invade Libya in 2011, we wouldn't have millions of Libyans sinking in the Mediterranean Sea and going into Italy and Greece and etc. Right? If the U.S. didn't fund a right-wing coup in Honduras in 2009, we wouldn't have millions of Hondurans coming into the United States. If the U.S. didn't fund death squads in Guatemala that are killing indigenous people, we wouldn't have so many indigenous people from Guatemala coming to the U.S. and looking for jobs. So that's really the point of my talk, is we have to be able to explain these phenomena in a way that really shows the true nature of the situation, which is the fact that immigrants are not the problem itself. They're a reaction to the problem. They're responding to the problem. And the problem is imperialism. The problem is a world economic system that is no longer able to even, maintain itself. It's no longer able, it's at a dead end, right? It's no longer able to continue sustaining the world economy. I think one of the most atrocious things I've seen in the media, as it relates to Puerto Rico, is notice the way that they cover the debt in Puerto Rico, right? I saw an article. I was waking up the other day, I was watching New York One, and there was some story, right? They were like, Governor Cuomo is visiting Puerto Rico to talk to Puerto Ricans and see how they can solve their debt crisis. What do you mean there? What do you mean their crisis? This is a U.S. crisis. And the U.S., they try to, at their own convenience, the capitalist class makes it seem, all of a sudden it's their crisis, right? They can pick and choose when it's our situation, right? Libya was our situation. Syria was our situation. It threatened our national security, supposedly. But now when Puerto Rico needs help, it's their situation. That's imperialism, plain and simple. That's imperialism. We don't need to read any of these huge texts to understand that. It's right there, right? To just wash your hands clean and say, that's $19 billion. That's Puerto Rico's issue. That's imperialism. When the last 100+ years, the U.S. has basically colonized Puerto Rico. There are more Puerto Ricans living in the U.S. now than in Puerto Rico. And I'm sure, unfortunately, something similar may happen with Syria. There may be more Syrians living in the UK or Germany in moving forward than there are in Syria. That's imperialism. And it's so important for us to really emphasize that we need to not only learn the objective facts, but we need to completely reshape the bourgeois way of understanding phenomena in the way that they have, because as I mentioned, the bourgeois scholars, the bourgeois media, the capitalist media has been treating the migrants, the immigrants, as the cause. I'm saying they're the effect. They're responding to a situation, and that's really the important aspect of it, is we need to teach people. I think it's so important for us to avoid the jargon, and we need to explain it to people, but we also need to not be afraid to teach people the theoretical basis of why we're able to understand this in the way we do. And this is so important because it'll allow people to understand future acts of imperialism and future ways of migration, right? So overall, I just want to say that of course, we stand in solidarity with the migrants coming from the Middle East and Latin America. They're responding to the situation. They're not to blame. They're reacting to the material conditions that they've been given. They're trying to survive. They didn't just decide out of nowhere, that they want to come here or to Europe and just supposedly take over people's jobs. They're literally fighting for their survival. And it's our job as Marxist-Leninists, as revolutionaries, to explain, to provide people the science, right, of dialectical materialism, of Marxism-Leninism, as a way to understand these phenomena. We need to educate our people and not be afraid to talk about these things, because there is a tendency to kind of underestimate the masses, right? And to say, okay, they're not ready to understand all these like heavy theoretical things, but this is the perfect situation to do so. And it's as simple as explaining, that they're responding to material conditions. They're not the cause. This isn't metaphysics. This isn't like, causality, right? They're responding to certain material conditions. So I just wanted to say that. I hope to see everyone at the protest tomorrow. Of course, we want to show our brothers and sisters from the Middle East and Latin America that these struggles are connected. The migrants and the migrants coming from the Middle East have to link up with the migrants from Latin America and the migrants from the Philippines, the migrants from all over the world. who are being affected by imperialism, by an economic system of capitalism that is has run out of options, that is now forced to bomb countries, to invade countries, and this is the only way out for them. So, thank you, and I hope that explains everything. So, the final remark I want to give in relation to United States and European Union imperialism causing the migrant refugee crisis is a great point that was brought up by Comrade Monica about how we see that same contradiction in the national scale in the U.S. In relation to black people in the United States and the oppression of the black nation in the U.S. I think that I'm hoping that in coming weeks, both movements of defending the migrants in Europe and as well as in the United States will come together with the Black Lives Matter movement, just because I think that they're so interconnected, and the struggle, the oppression of black people in the United States is so interconnected with the oppression of people around the world. I just see it as a difference in geographically, right? Because the same contradiction, and again this relates back to really quickly, right? The Marxist understanding of core and periphery. Right, you have the core, the imperialist core, which is the United States and Europe, where these are the imperialist centers that pillage other places. On the global scale, right, you have U.S. and Europe, which are the core of capitalism, that pillage the periphery, which is Asia, Africa, Latin America, for profits. In the U.S., you can even see it in terms of the Civil War with the North and the South, right? In New York, you could see it with Manhattan and East New York, right? You can go to any bodega in New York City, right? And you'll see a bodega in a black and Latino neighborhood, right? Maybe with I've been to so many bodegas in New York City with people, the workers are, from Yemen. There's so many people from Yemen who work in bodegas in New York City who came here, guess what? Because they were forced out of their homeland, right? Then you see the guy making the sandwich in the back of the bodega. He's from Mexico or Central America. Why is he here? NAFTA, right? Then you see the people who are in the bodega, who are black and brown people in inner city neighborhoods who are forced in there because guess what? Their families were forced out of the South or wherever to get there, to live there. So you see these contradictions. You could my point is basically that we don't have to search so far to see imperialism. You can go to your local bodega and see imperialism right there. You can see the way why is it that there's a cashier from Yemen, a sandwich maker from Mexico, and worker black and brown workers in the bodega, right? And it's because of imperialism. It's just a matter of it manifests itself in different levels, and it's so important for the struggle to defend migrant rights to converge with the Black Lives Matter movement, because it's the same capitalist imperialist system that created the conditions for both oppressions to begin with. The oppression of black and brown people in the U.S. is intimately intertwined with the oppression of people of color around the world. So that's really my final point is, we don't have to search far and wide to understand why the migrant crisis is happening. You can see it in your own neighborhood. You can see it in your own surroundings, how interconnected the oppression of black and brown people in the U.S. is with the oppression of people around the world by imperialism. So, I'm hoping that in coming weeks, there can maybe be more events around how to connect the Black Lives Matter movement and the Black liberation struggle with the struggle of migrant rights and migrants in Europe and the United States, because they're intimately interconnected. They're so connected and they're caused by the same thing. And I'm just glad that Monica raised that, because we see that same dialectical contradiction even within, you know, the U.S., right? It's not just, it's happening with like U.S. and other countries, but it's also happening with even in neighborhoods, you know, the police, the NYPD, and people of color, people of color in like East New York. The same thing is happening. It's just different degrees, but it's the same phenomena. It just like presents itself in different levels according to where you are, but it's the same struggle. So that's what I want to say. Black Lives Matter struggle is the struggle for migrant rights. So thank you.